At 12:59 in the afternoon, Pacific time on September 14th, 2017, a spacecraft that had spent 13 years orbiting Saturn pointed its camera one last time and took a photograph. It didn't know it was the last one. Spacecraft don't know things like that. But the team on the ground did, and less than 16 hours later, that photograph would become the final image any camera aboard Cassini would ever capture. A grainy, monochrome view of a patch of Saturn's nightside, quietly showing the exact spot where the spacecraft itself was about to die. Tonight, we're looking at what Cassini actually photographed in its final hours, why its imaging team called those pictures a gift to the entire planet, and why, years later, a fake version of that final image still keeps fooling people online, standing in for a truth that turns out to be even more remarkable than the myth. To understand why Cassini's final images carried so much weight, you have to understand what the spacecraft had already given us over more than a decade at Saturn. Cassini launched in October 1997 and entered orbit around Saturn in 2004, beginning a mission that would end up running more than 3 times longer than originally planned. Over those 13 years, its cameras captured well over 400,000 images, building humanity's most detailed portrait ever assembled of a planet beyond Earth. Its rings, its dozens of moons, and the strange, ever-shifting weather patterns swirling across its cloud tops. By the time the mission's end finally arrived, Cassini's imaging team, led by Carolyn Porco of the Space Science Institute, had spent over a decade serving as the eyes through which humanity watched an entire alien world in motion. That archive of images did more than simply document Saturn. It fundamentally changed how the public related to a planet most people had only ever seen as a small ringed dot through a backyard telescope or a textbook illustration. Cassini turned Saturn into a place with weather, with seasons, with individual moons that had personalities of their own in the public imagination, Titan with its methane lakes, Enceladus with its icy geysers, Iapetus with its strange two-toned surface. Each new image released during the mission's 13 years added another layer to that portrait, until Saturn stopped feeling like a distant abstraction and started feeling like somewhere real, somewhere Cassini had actually been again and again for over a decade. As Cassini's fuel ran low in 2017, mission planners set the spacecraft on its final trajectory, a series of dives that would eventually send it plunging directly into Saturn's atmosphere, both to end the mission safely and to gather one last, irreplaceable set of close-up measurements no earlier phase of the mission had dared attempt in its final days. Rather than simply falling silent, Cassini's imaging team turned the spacecraft's last views into something closer to a farewell tour. On September 13th, 2017, just 2 days before the end, Cassini captured a series of images that the team would later release together as a kind of visual goodbye. It photographed Saturn's giant moon Titan, its thick, hazy atmosphere glowing faintly in the frame one final time. It captured Enceladus, the small icy moon whose subsurface ocean and erupting plumes Cassini had spent years studying, setting quietly behind Saturn's enormous disk. It photographed the delicate structure of Saturn's rings, including a lone propeller, a small gap-like feature carved out by a tiny embedded moonlet trying and failing to fully clear a path through the ring material. And it captured a wide, sweeping view of Saturn's northern hemisphere, one final look at the swirling cloud bands the spacecraft had tracked changing season after season for over a decade. There was nothing accidental about the order or selection of these final subjects. The imaging team deliberately chose to revisit exactly the kinds of targets that had defined the mission's greatest discoveries, the moons whose secrets Cassini had spent years unlocking, the rings whose fine structure it had mapped in unprecedented detail, the atmosphere whose seasonal changes it had tracked longer than any instrument before it. Watching Enceladus quietly set behind Saturn one last time wasn't simply a pretty picture. It was a deliberate echo of years of work studying that same small moon's hidden ocean. A goodbye aimed specifically at one of the mission's most significant scientific legacies, rather than a random parting glance. Every frame captured during those final 48 hours carried the weight of everything that had come before it. Then, on September 14th, at 12:59 p.m. Pacific time, less than 16 hours before the end of the mission, Cassini's wide-angle camera captured what would become its final photograph, taken from a distance of roughly 394,000 miles, about 634,000 kilometers, above Saturn's cloud tops. The image looked toward the planet's nightside, a region cloaked in darkness, illuminated only faintly by sunlight reflecting off Saturn's own rings. Inside that quiet, monochrome frame sat something the spacecraft's own team had specifically planned for, a view of the exact region of Saturn's atmosphere where Cassini itself would plunge to its destruction. Hours later, once that same patch of sky rotated into daylight. NASA also released natural separate images taken through red, green, and blue filters, alongside a companion infrared image captured around the same time by Cassini's visual and infrared mapping. Spectrometer, showing heat radiating outward from deep inside Saturn's interior, glowing red beneath dark, silhouetted clouds, with the spacecraft's intended point of entry marked directly within the frame. Consider the strange, almost impossible engineering achievement buried inside that single photograph. Cassini's team had to calculate, in advance, with enough precision, exactly where on Saturn's vast surface the spacecraft would eventually enter the atmosphere, then aim its camera at that specific patch of night-shrouded cloud, on a night side illuminated only by faint, borrowed light bouncing off the rings themselves, and capture a usable image of a location that, at the moment of the photograph, hadn't yet rotated into daylight. It's the visual equivalent of photographing your own grave the night before an appointment you already know you can't miss, then handing that photograph to the people who love you, so they'd know exactly where to look when the moment finally arrived. There is something genuinely difficult to describe about a spacecraft photographing the exact spot it's about to die in, hours in advance, on purpose, simply because the science was worth capturing on the way down. Carolyn Porco, reflecting on the imaging team's work at the end of the mission, described the experience in terms that went beyond ordinary scientific language. She and her team, she said, had been especially fortunate to serve as the documentarians of this historic chapter of exploration, returning a stirring visual record of everything Cassini had witnessed during its years traveling around Saturn. She called the collection of final images a gift offered specifically to the people of planet Earth, a description that captures something true about what made this ending different from an ordinary mission conclusion. These weren't just data points collected for analysis. They were deliberately composed, deliberately shared, a final act of storytelling from a spacecraft that had spent 13 years teaching humanity how to actually see another planet. Cassini kept gathering and transmitting scientific data, even after its cameras stopped capturing new images, continuing to sample Saturn's atmosphere directly as it fell, sending that information home in real time for every second contact remained possible. The spacecraft's very last signal was received on Earth on September 15, 2017 at 4:55 a.m. Pacific time. Arriving after a communication delay of roughly 83 minutes, the time light itself needed to cross the distance between Saturn and Earth. Moments after, that signal ended. Cassini was torn apart by atmospheric friction and vaporized, becoming, in a very real and literal sense, a small part of the planet it had spent over a decade studying. Inside mission control at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the final minutes played out in near silence, a room full of engineers and scientists who had spent years, single spacecraft, watching a signal on a screen slowly weaken and then simply stop. There was no dramatic final image transmitted in that last stretch, no cinematic parting shot captured as the spacecraft actually broke apart. By that point, Cassini's cameras had already been powered down deliberately, their job finished, while the remaining instruments continued measuring atmospheric composition for as long as physically possible. The team had planned it that way specifically, prioritizing every last second of scientific data over any temptation to keep photographing straight through to the very end. What makes this story worth revisiting now isn't only the images themselves, remarkable as they are, it's what's happened to their memory in the years since. In December 2024, a video claiming to show the actual last photograph taken by Cassini before it disintegrated went viral on social media, racking up millions of views. The image was strikingly colorful, dramatic, almost cinematic in its saturation. It was also completely fake, an artistic recreation, not a genuine photograph Cassini ever captured. In fact, checkers eventually traced the confusion and set the record straight. Cassini's real final images were monochrome, considerably less vivid and far more restrained than the version that had gone viral, precisely because they were genuine scientific instruments doing genuine scientific work, not artwork designed to maximize visual drama. In a strange way, that correction only deepens the emotional weight of the real photographs. The true final image of Cassini's mission isn't some dazzling, oversaturated fantasy. It's a quiet, grainy, black and white view of darkness lit faintly by borrowed ringlight, precisely marking the spot where a 13-year journey was about to end, exactly as the team who built and flew that spacecraft understood it to be. That gap between the viral fake and the real photograph says something worth sitting with. The manufactured version needed exaggeration to feel significant, bright colors and dramatic framing standing in for genuine emotional weight. The actual image needed none of that. Its power came entirely from context, from knowing exactly what it showed, and exactly why it had been taken. A plain, honest photograph carrying more genuine gravity than any artificially embellished version ever could, simply because everything about it was true. That's the real story behind Cassini's final images. Not a single dramatic photograph capturing some impossible last-second view, but a deliberate, carefully planned farewell, stretched across its final 48 hours, revisiting the moons, the rings, and the swirling clouds the spacecraft had spent 13 years coming to know, before turning its camera one last time toward the small, dark patch of atmosphere where its own story would end. Cassini didn't just document Saturn until the very last possible moment. It made sure humanity got to see exactly where and how that journey was going to conclude, choosing transparency and beauty over silence, right up until the signal finally stopped arriving. Nearly a decade later, those final, unassuming photographs remain some of the most quietly powerful images any spacecraft has ever sent home, precisely because nothing about them needed to be exaggerated to matter. If you want to be here exploring the real story behind humanity's greatest space missions, subscribe and turn on notifications, because nearly a decade after Cassini's last transmission reached Earth, its final images are still teaching us something true, even as fabricated versions of that same story keep trying to take their place.